Hi there. I'm making this video, it'll be a short one, to talk about a topic or theme that's been in the media, popular media, a lot the last few months, and that's the idea of boys will be boys, which is a kind of excuse for all kinds of masculine behaviors. I talk about this a lot in my book, which is called Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace. The book is available on Amazon and also at the publisher's website, Routledge, Routledge. Someone asked me recently, actually it was in response to one of the other videos, what do I mean when I talk about the inner world? Because when I speak about alienation, I'm talking about a loss of contact with what's deep inside yourself. And it can also mean a loss of contact with people and other meaningful relationships in the outer world. So that's the tricky thing about alienation, is it's really got this double meaning. And that means both in terms of what goes on inside ourselves and what happens outside ourselves. So someone asked, what do you mean when you say the inner world? And the inner world is really that place inside us where we imagine things, where we daydream, where we actually have dreams at night that we remember the next day and we try and make sense out of. It's where our creativity and our ambitions come from. It's where our aspirations grow and are nurtured. And it's also where a template about our relationships is housed. And this template is so important because it helps us to trust others and to open ourselves to others. And if that template is somehow distorted, and that happens to a large number of us, so I'm not trying to say this is an either-or kind of situation, but when that template for forming and building relationships is distorted, then we often are mistrustful, we often are guarded, we often can kind of go on the offense rather than listening to someone. So it's a kind of problem that can make us quite defensive and shut down. So there's an awful lot that's going on in the inner world. But we often think of the inner world as psyche, which is an interesting word because in Greek it initially meant breath. And so you think again about the breath, which gives us life. We take in from the outside, we use the good stuff in the air, the oxygen, and then we exhale. And that's something about psyche too, in a metaphorical way, that we take things in, we process them, we make use of them, and then hopefully we give something back, we put something back out there. So boys will be boys as a kind of is a shorthand in my mind for discounting the importance of the inner world for boys, teenage boys, and young men and older men. And what it does is it really kind of just reinforces a sense of a rigid form of masculinity that is molded to the outer world, that really doesn't reach too far inside, because that's often felt to be something dangerous and potentially feminizing. And so boys will be boys is kind of like looking at rigid masculine belief systems that we take in because that's what we see. We see this either in popular media or in our families, in our cultures, and these are often beliefs about men being strong, men being stoic, men suffering without crying, men and boys being tough, being anything but soft, gentle, emotional, affectionate. Those things, that's the rigidity, I think, of boys will be boys and the harm that it can cause. So so I think that you're getting from what I'm saying that one of the fundamental flaws in Boys Will Be Boys is it actually unbalances male development, because it discredits what's inside, and it tends to shut down that valuable connection with what happens inside the male psyche. I would also say that Boys Will Be Boys is a rationalization. It's an excuse, right? That's used a lot. And it can be used to justify bullying. It can be used to justify things like sexually aggressive behaviors that overstep, including assault. It can also be used to justify male anger and male rage in ways that aren't at all helpful. So when boys fight in a particularly over-the-top kind of way, that's really something we want to think about. Like, how do we make sense out of those actions? How do we talk and think about those things? And when you say Boys Will Be Boys, that shuts that all down. That shuts that analysis, that conversation, that deepening down. So the other thing I want to say about this, this is going to be a shorter video, but the other thing I want to say is that the funny thing about boys, this kind of saying, Boys Will Be Boys, is it really objectifies boys and men. And we think a lot about the objectification of women, and the harmful aspects of that it really, objectification is really about the exterior. It creates a superficial sense of who a person is and what they're capable of. And the problem, I think, with any sort of objectification is, again, it doesn't allow for a deepening. And that deepening, I think, isn't just something that happens outside. It has to happen inside, to be really meaningful, to find context, and to be really in touch with that inner world that I was talking about a couple of minutes ago. And so when you objectify someone and you teach them to objectify themselves, we're doing a disservice to what happens inside a person. We're doing a disservice to their abilities and capacities to dream, to have ambitions, and to think of themselves in a way that really is personally meaningful. And so I think Boys Will Be Boys, it impacts a lot of things. It impacts male relationships, it impacts their sexuality, and it tends to pull in this direction for making things superficial, exterior, skin deep. And the reason I'm going to give one quick example about skin deep that I've observed. I mean, I experienced this personally when I was a boy. And I see it now when I go to the gym, and it's this idea of towel snapping, where you get a towel and you kind of turn it into a rope and you snap it at another guy, and there can be a lot that's playful about this, but it's interesting because it's often associated with taunts, with kind of insults, and a sort of posturing, and just this whole kind of scene, in a way, is something about using that towel, using it as a whip, posturing in a way that is really saying, don't be soft, take it if it hurts, you gotta be tough, and the only thing that really matters is how you look and how hard you can be. And so I use this as an example in the book, and I'm really just kind of saying it here because I have heard dads and kind of try to explain when their sons do this sort of thing as, well, that's just boys being boys. And it's, to some extent, there is a bit of truth in that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't moments where male energy can get very, very kind of over the top, but also very forceful, assertive, And you know, some of that is not particularly in this area of what I'm talking about that's doing harm. It's about masculine energy looking for a way to express itself. But where it gets rationalized, I think, as kind of something like that isn't worth thinking about, isn't worth trying to understand, that's where we get into really serious trouble. And so lastly, I think what I want to say is that this idea of boys will be boys, in a way, it's also, you know, I mentioned before that it does a disservice both to relationships and to the inner world, but it also does a disservice to all of us. It's letting us down, because it really deprives boys and men, and in a way, when we say this, it deprives them of greater understanding, of giving meaning, and of trying to think of, well, are there other ways, other things that happen inside me that I could do instead, or that I want to do instead. So, so boys will be boys in that sense is a kind of social statement as well as a psychological one that weakens families, it weakens our schools, and it has a toll on all of us when we try and use that as a rationalization for really aggressive, sometimes violent, very self-destructive and destructive behaviors. So boys will be boys is best kept in the category of a saying that you might want to use on a rare occasion, but trying to really resort to it as a way to understand boys and men is not doing anybody a favor. Okay, thank you for listening.